kiss for you.
We're taking a look at Destiny 2. This is kind of a complicated one, so obviously we're looking at Destiny 2 from a new player experience in probably the worst time to ever jump into something like Destiny 2. I have some experience with the game as I played it when Beyond Light launched for a little bit there. I mentioned that in my first Descendant video that I was interested in, Destiny 2 and what it was doing during Beyond Light, but I never really got very far in it, never really did a ton of stuff, never bought any of the expansions, anything like that. But I tried to give it a very concerted effort this time because the Legacy Collection, which is everything except the most current stuff, was like $12. So I bought it. I was like, yeah, let's jump back into it. Let's see what happens here. And overall, my experience has kind of fallen into two camps. Yep, this is still the same Destiny I remember it as, and wow, it's gotten way weirder. And I guess I'll kind of start by talking about what Destiny 2 is for those uninitiated, and more so what you would experience if you are actually a new player. So Destiny 2 overall, I would say, is a sci-fi looter shooter from the people that have made and championed Halo. They decided to make Destiny 2 here after the first game Destiny did very well and wanted to expand on the capabilities of that game. And then they, typical looter shooter live service model. It was paid originally, and then you went through each of the expansions and did the story campaigns and that kind of stuff, and then did, the larger raids and events and things like that. And that kind of setup lasted for about 4 years or so, 5 years or so, until they went free to play. And then they kind of changed the model around, changed what's accessible and what wasn't, and all that. And overall, fast forward 5 years past that initial restart of the model, and we're at what the Destiny 2 is currently in the current year, 2025. So the best way I can describe Destiny 2 now as a new player, for a new player, is this. If you're actually new to the game, which you may be at this point, you'll make your character as standard. You'll go through the Beyond Light, which is the 2020 tutorial, and you'll land at the starting screen, which I'll show in a second. If you played any previous Destiny content at any point, you'll see your character in the little character select. You'll click on it, play, and you'll log in to the intro mission for the latest expansion. You'll play the intro mission, you'll get that, and then after which, when you complete that mission, you'll enter into the same starting screen, right? From this starting screen, you can go to the Quest tab and check out anything that sounds interesting. In my case, because I have the Legacy Collection, I have Witch Queen, Lightfall, and the Final Shape expansion campaigns available to me, and some exotic weapon quests which are labeled in yellow. I can track any quest that I want to, and it will pop up, and I go to the world section. This is kind of your map of where you can teleport to, right? You can teleport to any of the planet zones there. In this case, to begin Witch Queen, you'll be going with the bottom left green planet there. And you'll go there, and it will, go into the planet, and it'll show you a map, and you click on the nearest teleport location, and you teleport there, and then you begin that quest. Again, the quests are mostly either campaign quests, exotic quests, or higher budget raids, right, for the most part. So as an overall kind of explainer of what it is, the most high budget single player expansion content, Witch Queen, Lightfall, Final Shape, Edge of Fate, upcoming Renegades, right, that kind of stuff, is where a lot of the bulk of the enjoyment comes for a lot of people, right? Every expansion that releases tends to have a single player narrative focused campaign, and then an end game power grind that is more seasonal based, with typically a dungeon or raid or multiples of those things at the end as kind of like your pinnacle celebratory, like, oh wow, look at this kind of thing, right? So in simple terms, overall, that is the game. You take your character with their gear, and you either do campaign missions and go through that whole thing, or you do quests, exotic quests, other various quests that pop up to grind gear to be able to take on that final dungeon or that final raid. So that's kind of the setup there, right? There are some other things relating to like PvP and other challenge modes as well, but for the most part, those are modifiers on the existing game, not really new frameworks with which to play the game. So, everything, ultimately speaking, is around that loop. It's playing campaign missions to get to endgame, doing other quests, exotic quests, that kind of thing to get to endgame, using endgame to gear up to be able to take on raids and dungeons. That's kind of the setup that Destiny 2 is operating under currently. And overall, it is one that I would say, generally speaking, works out, except for some issues which we'll talk about. Overall, though, I would say that this kind of framework for the game is one that people enjoy, roughly, right? However, it does have some issues. And one of the main issues is the fact that for a new player, it's extremely confusing when they jump into it what they should be doing at any point. That is why recently, as of a couple months ago, they introduced a portal feature which tries to simplify things. It gives you, what you should be doing, technically speaking, and all that. For my money, anyway, in terms of for my advice, ignore that and instead go to the quests, go to your quest tab, the second one, and click on anything that sounds interesting, right? Whether it be a campaign mission or an exotic quest or whatever, and just then go to the world map and teleport and start doing that. That will give you the best introduction, if you will, to kind of how the game operates without immediately jumping into a multiplayer activity, right? So just, that's my advice, right? Is if you're trying this game out and you're interested in this, go to quests, do those things first, and then when you're ready and feel more comfortable, go into the solo content or the other things. Because effectively speaking, that portal mode is sort of like a COD or a Battlefield. It's like a jump into the multiplayer aspect, even if not all the elements there are multiplayer specifically, right? It's kind of like jumping in, I'll use Halo as an example, right? It's like jumping in at the end of a Halo campaign to replay a bunch of missions with modifiers, right? It's like you don't want to do that until you actually play through the campaign first, or play through at least enough of the early game to really understand things before you kind of jump in and start messing with stuff, right? So that's there. In terms of actual gameplay elements, right, that's just kind of the setup and the structure. It was a little bit long, sorry about that, but it is important to kind of understand what Destiny 2 is and the framework around it first before we actually get talking about what you're doing in it. So I would, broadly speaking, categorize the next couple elements in terms of game design in things like character classes, gunplay, loot, and stuff like that. So ultimately, it's a looter shooter. You're going to be looting and shooting and guns and all that stuff and completing objectives, missions, that kind of thing, right? And you do that via selecting a class. Now, my class is the Warlock. There's also the Titan and a couple others, I believe. And those classes are your starting point. They do not determine much other than your subclasses, your options for subclasses, but broadly speaking, you won't be disappointed with any specific main class. The subclasses is where it gets interesting. For my Warlock, for instance, I have 3 subclasses, one that uses dark energy, one that uses frost, and one that uses fire. And within those, you can modify different elements of them, your abilities, your jump, your aspects, which are just modifiers to your abilities, and then your fragments, which are passive bonuses that you can get for that class, for that subclass. And that's really where the customization in the character becomes active, right? If you play things like Borderlands, that's your skills and your augments and stuff like that. So that's kind of where you start building out your class and your build and what you want to do. And I would say overall that works very well. It is limiting at the start, but I think that limiting also is very helpful because it lets you kind of figure, okay, what do I want to do? And most of the time, what you're just going to do is whether the default is. You don't have to set anything of this up. When you select a subclass, it by default puts a bunch of abilities in and puts aspects in and puts fragments. So you don't have to really worry about setting that up or forgetting. It kind of just sets it up by default. But overall, that's kind of how the class system works. It's built on this idea of subclasses and benefits and losses between that, which is a little bit different than something like Borderlands or Warframe, whose classes or frames aren't super, are a little bit, I would say, a little bit stronger, more focused, right? Like Vex in Borderlands 4, for instance, has a couple different options and ways to play that are fundamentally different from each other. Versus, Trouble versus the Spectres versus the Giant Orb. Classes in Destiny 2 are a little bit more homogenized in terms of the Warlock, 3 different classes are playing pretty similar to each other, even if there is a good amount of differences between them. Roughly the end result is do a ton of damage or heal, right? Those are usually the 2 end results there. So moving on to gunplay here is a fun one. Destiny 2, obviously from being part of Bungie, which had worked on Halo and previous games before Destiny, right? Has very good gunplay, one of the best, although I do think Borderlands 4 at this point is above it in terms of things like feedback and hit markers and reload and quality of animations and things like that. But I do think, generally speaking, just from a pure gunplay and from how guns feel, it's definitely still one of the best, right? So not to knock that or anything, I just think at this point, 10 years almost later since Destiny 2, games have definitely gotten considerably better in terms of things like animations and hit markers and sound effects and things, right, that I think elevate those games. But that's not to say that Destiny 2 has bad or even mediocre gunplay. I think the gunplay is still a highlight of the game there. Guns feel great, they sound great, they have good reaction and recoil, there's a good variety of them. The exotics that you have, my Risk Runner here is awesome, right, in terms of the options that you have and how they interplay with each of the different, the shock ability and stuff works very well and is continuously fun to use. And the only real issue I have with the gunplay is, again, things like hit markers are kind of weak, reloading and the animations of that are kind of dull, and things take a long time to reload, that kind of stuff. That's more of a personal preference rather than like a knock to the gunplay. Moving on to things like loot. And this is a very big contention point with the game, but I overall think it's okay and it does a pretty good job of maintaining itself. What I mean by that is they keep redoing the power system. So instead of something like Borderlands where you just have a numerical DPS value and then some minor stats that you can figure out, how much damage per shot, fire rate, that kind of thing, Destiny 2 uses a straight power system. You have a main power number, you have the other stats below that are similar to something like Borderlands, but the main power element there is not very helpful. Not to say that the DPS level in something like Borderlands is much better, but I think the power level here is quite misleading because oftentimes my Risk Runner, the original gun I had 5-6 years ago, is still better damage and better output than a new gun that has like 20 or 30 more power level, right? The power level doesn't really indicate much more other than the fact that when they reset the power thing, everything got to 10. Anything above 10 is technically speaking new gear oftentimes, but that does not necessarily mean it's better, especially needing to take into account fire rate, which unfortunately is not something that is easily viewable. Like the fire rate per second or anything is usually just like a bar, and it shows you like the low or high amount. And like, it's hard to kind of internalize what's a fire rate that's really high compared to something that's really low, right? And oftentimes that gets a little muddy, but I would overall say, other than that weird power thing that keeps happening where they keep squishing the power and expanding things, the loot, generally speaking, is interesting, right? Exotics that drop are fun to use and stay fun to use throughout a lot of aspects of the game. The only thing I wish that happened, I guess, is that you had more than 3 categories of weapons. Broadly speaking, if you go to your inventory, you'll see your main gun, you'll see like energy weapons, and then you'll see usually special weapons. And so there's like multiple types, right? Like grenade launchers and hand cannons and submachine guns and stuff, but you only have 3 different categories, like broad categories, those guns can fall under. And so if you're using, for instance, I have a grenade launcher on my 3rd one, and I wanted to use a sword. Well, I can't use both a grenade launcher and a sword. I have to choose because both are energy weapons, right? It's that kind of thing where like you're kind of limited in terms of what you want to be able to use. And something like Borderlands, that's not the case. You have complete freedom. If you want to use 4 submachine guns, you totally can, right? Not so in Destiny 2. You do have to choose between using certain energy weapons. And that's not to say you can't have all primary or all special ammo types, which are different. That is just to say the category that loot falls under is unfortunately something that is relatively limiting in terms of what you're able to really build out, right? You can't, as I mentioned, you can't have a sword and a grenade launcher oftentimes because those tend to be in the same selector, the same camp. But I would say other than those 2 issues in terms of loot, everything else works relatively well. Now we're going to go on to, I say, the last 3 sections here, which are more so about how the Destiny 2 is set up and what value it has, which is more, again, back to the framework, but these are kind of a little bit more specific. Campaigns. A lot of interest has been taken over the years for Destiny 2's use of sunsetting previous campaigns. And the broad consensus from pretty much everyone, especially at this point, is that doing that's a horrible idea and you should absolutely not do it. The idea of sunsetting campaigns is at some point, the early campaigns of Beyond Light and Forsaken and Shadowkeep and stuff and all the previous expansions went away. You are no longer able to access them, and all that remains is some smaller subset of missions that you can do that are a far cry from the original campaign. And it was done that way for a maintenance and ability to maintain the aspects of the game and not have just a bunch of dead content around there, right? Unfortunately, everyone saw that this was a bad idea, and it has continued to be brought up as the single worst thing Destiny 2 has ever done, and part of the reason for its downfall is this shelving or sunsetting of not only the campaigns, but also everything that came with the campaigns, the campaign weapons, the characters oftentimes, right, the setting, the environments, that kind of thing. Most of those things ended up being shelved when the campaign gets sunset. Now, that is not to say that right here in 2025, most of it isn't, right? Witch Queen is the earliest that you can go back to, and that is 2022, so that was 3 years ago. You can play that campaign. The next year's Lightfall campaign. You have Lightfall 2023, 2024, Final Shape 2024, 2025, and then obviously right now you have Edge of Fate going into Renegade. It's a little bit different structure there, but you can still go back 2021 to 2022 size with both the weapons and the actual campaign narrative and play that. So I think that's an okay system as long as they keep it at that time stretch. The biggest problem is oftentimes, right, as they've adjusted other parts of the framework, it becomes very hard to tell and differentiate between what's actually worth playing. And that is something that we kind of move into the next section of, which is grind, right? It doesn't necessarily matter about the campaigns and how many there are and all that stuff if the things you get in the campaigns are useless. This is a big issue that World of Warcraft has, and while I think World of Warcraft has a little bit better of a system where you can still access the older content in newer versions of the game, and to some capacity still enjoy the game like that, it does still suffer from this problem where like the stuff you're getting in those campaigns are functionally useless because the minute you start a new campaign like Edge of Fate, those items are functionally, over leveled and geared higher because of that curve that effectively makes anything you do previously kind of worthless. And so that's kind of where we get into the grind aspect of, at least from what I can tell, the main thing you're doing in the game is grinding power level. Right, that main core stat that I mentioned that doesn't really help that much. And the reason I say that is because that is the thing to do. You may have noticed when I talked about framework and when I talked about, other game design elements that I didn't really talk about where you're going. I talked about the fact that at the end of it, there's a dungeon and a raid, or some capacity of those things, which is very cool. But I didn't really talk about, what are you doing in between the dungeon and the campaign? And that's kind of the thing, because the campaigns are not super long. They're like 10 hours or so, and you can play it on harder difficulties, right? But there's usually a big gap and a big difference between the end of the campaign and your ability to do a dungeon and raid. And oftentimes, the difference between that is a lot of grinding. And in recent expansions, specifically Edge of Fate 2 months ago, they made that even harder to do and even longer to do. And that's ultimately kind of the rub with a lot of people, is that once you finish the campaign and once you've kind of done everything you wanted to do there's a long tail grind of weeks and weeks and months of grinding to be able to get enough power and enough gear and enough people in your clan or whatever to be able to actually attempt the new end pinnacle content raid and dungeons, right? And that is really the rub for a lot of people, is that this new system and framework has effectively made grinding the only thing to do. When before it was you could kind of do the campaign on your own time and then do some grinding, and then eventually you could kind of just roll into raids. At this point, at least from what I understand for a lot of people, again, I'm still a relatively new player, so I don't have all the information here that I would if I had been, from the start. But from what I understand, the grind here is effectively lengthened and gone into larger parts of it. Like the recent Edge of Fate expansion really isn't much of a campaign. It's more so just an excuse to replay missions and grind stuff, right? They've done a lot of work to make that doable for whatever reason. And so a lot of people feel like as more expansions happen, that the campaigns and the actual quality of that is getting worse and worse. And the grind, the middle part of the game between the campaign and dungeons, is getting longer and longer and more tedious. And so oftentimes people talk about the grind in that aspect, and they are very annoyed about what's happening. So just kind of setting the groundwork there for what people kind of feel annoyed at. And I can't comment on this part specifically because I'm not there yet, right? I'm still in the campaign process. But I have a feeling that if at any point I do get to that grind section, that's where people kind of fall off. And that's where I want to talk about the last section here, which is money. And that might be odd because I did mention that I got everything that the game has to offer except for the most recent expansion for like $12. But that is something to know, that Destiny 2, if you're keeping up with it at a current level, is quite expensive. The previous expansions, when they were new, were $50 each, and then you had to typically buy the seasonal content or the seasonal passes, which were similar to like battle passes, but they had important quests that you needed to do in order to have enough gear to be able to do the raids, right? That kind of thing. So while they were battle passes, they kind of operated a lot more like seasonal content in other games, right? You have to buy the seasonal pass to be able to experience a lot of the quests and a lot of the seasonal stuff that they were doing. It's not like Diablo, for instance, where you can just hop in and there it is. It was something, at least from what I understand, that you pretty much have to buy into. So getting 4 of those would be about $40 there for however long that season lasted. So right there, you're looking at $90, and then they also charge you for a dungeon key for whatever reason, which is like the big pinnacle dungeon that these expansions often have. That's an extra $20. So all in, you're looking at $110 to $120 every single year, because Destiny 2 expansions, unlike MMO expansions, release yearly. So that's kind of the model, right? It was $50 for the first expansion, for the expansion that year. $40 for the continual season passes, which did include, standard battle pass stuff on top of quests and things, and then a dungeon key at the end, $110, $120, right? That was the model pretty much until this year, when they decided to do a smaller 2 expansion a year type thing, where each of them is $40, but if you buy the whatever edition, in this case it's the Prophecy edition, you get both of those expansions and the passes for the entire season included. So that saves you about $20 there, right? If you buy just the Edge of Fate, the most recent expansion, it's $40, and then you get the 1 season pass there, like one of them. And then if you do the Renegade one, the upcoming one, again, same thing. But if you buy the Prophecy edition, which is the $80 one, you get both of the expansions, which would typically be $80 in their own right, and then you get 4 the passes. So you get 2 extra passes, right? And that theoretically is an extra $20 to $24, depending on how the currency exchange works, yada yada. And that's kind of where they think they get a deal, because the expansions are technically $10 cheaper than they typically are, and if you buy them in the bundle there, you get the seasonal content, right? But effectively, all it's done is just de-incentivize the reason to pick up expansions when they launch, because it's very clear that they aren't going to be worth that money, so you just wait until they're like significantly cheaper, like I did, right? Like Final Shape, which launched last year, I believe, around about a year and a couple months ago, right? Year and 3 months ago or so. It launched in sometime in June. That was a $50 expansion, right, with all that stuff. And I bought it for $10, I'm pretty sure, is what it had in the kind of thing. And even then, I didn't buy it for 10. I bought the entire thing for 12, right? So it's that kind of thing where you effectively just devalue the expansion by putting it on such a sale and having that kind of thing be that way, right? And the reason they did that, if you're interested, is because they changed the model to be 2 smaller expansions that are pretty much just a little bit bigger than seasonal content updates for the most part, that just are smaller and are meant to give you things to do, as the team that has been building this game went from like thousands of people to like itty bitty, right? So that's overall the money thing, is that it used to be very expensive, $110, $120. Now it's $80. So you are technically saving money, but you are getting a worse experience for most people's metrics. So hopefully that's all the stuff you need to know about Destiny 2, from the framework to the character classes, how the gunplay works, the quality of the loot, what campaigns are and how they operate, and the sunsetting of them, how that grind affects the motivation and people wanting to play the game, and the money changing hands in that, right? Last thing I'll just mention, there is a store, an Eververse store. It's just cosmetics and a bunch of crap, so it's not that important, but it is a point in money where it's like, even beyond all this, there's a cost associated with just having the game operational. And so pretty much everything here and that I mentioned is, like, if you go through this entire video here, and anything I meant and talked about is interesting, play Destiny 2. If you listen to what I said here and you think, oh my god, he's insane, what the hell is this? Don't play Destiny 2, right? Like, that's really it. I talked probably for 5 or 6 minutes about the framework of the game, and I talked about the end here about the money and the grind. if most of the video is talking about things that aren't the game, and you have this small section in the middle where I actually talk about the game, that's usually a sign that the game is not heading in a great direction. So hopefully that was interesting. Hopefully from my player experience, you're able to find some value in that. If you did, make sure to like, subscribe, do all that, and I'll see everyone in the next video.